Hi class, and welcome to this week's online lecture. This week we're going to be going over the social structure theories of crime. The first part, there's two parts um, to this lecture. We're mostly going to focus on the early development of strain theory and the particular models that followed it, the theories that followed the strain theory. So these are your objectives for this week. We're going to distinguish the social structure theories from other models or perspectives that we previously presented in this course. We're going to explain what contributions and conceptual development Durkheim added to the evolution of his perspective around the turn of the 19th century. We're going to explain why Merton's theory of strain became popular exactly when it did, as well as how conceptualization of anomie was different from that of Durkheim's. We're going to identify some of the revisions or variations of strain theory presented a couple of decades later and how they differ from Merton's original theory. We're also going to evaluate how Agnew's proposed model of general strain added more sources of strain to Merton's original framework or idea. And lastly, we're going to identify some ways the various models of strain theory have informed policymaking in attempts to reduce our criminality. So before we begin discussing the background of these theories, we're going to need to differentiate between this type of theory and the other types of theories that we discussed earlier in this class. So in particular, these type of theories try to explain criminal conduct that emphasize the differences among varying groups and societies, particularly those in the United States. And these differences among groups are easy to see in everyday life. Many theoretical models have been developed that will place the blame for crime on observed inequalities or cultural differences among different groups. Now, in contrast to the theories that have been presented in previous weeks that we've discussed, the social structure theories are going to disregard any biological or psychological variations that individuals may have. In particular, they're going to emphasize on physiological factors. Social structure theories assume that crime is caused by the way societies are structurally organized. So the most important distinction of these social structure theories as opposed to those discussed in previous weeks is that they emphasize on group differences instead of individual differences. So in other words, these structural models are going to focus on the macro level of analysis versus the micro level. That's why it's not surprising that social structure theories are commonly used to explain the propensity of certain racial or ethnic groups to commit crimes, as well as the overrepresentation of the lower class in criminal activity. Now, when we start to discuss these theories, we're going to look at Europe during the early to mid 1800s and what was going on in Europe during that time. Now, the theories that we're going to discuss, their work was largely inspired by the social dynamics that resulted in particular from the Industrial Revolution. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, societies were quickly transitioning from primarily agricultural-based economies to more industrial-based economies, and this transformation led to populations moving from primarily rural farmland to dense urban cities, which seemed to cause a lot of increase in social problems. And the social problems that we're going to focus on, or we're more worried about, is higher rates of crime during this point in time. So there were problems that were associated with a lot of urbanization or fast urbanization when everyone was moving from the farmlands into the cities, and from the shift in economics. And this led to a drastic change in basic social structures in not only in Europe but also in the United States. So the first theorist we're going to discuss is Auguste Comte. He's widely credited with coining the term sociology. Remember, criminology originally fell under that sphere because he was the first to be recognized for emphasizing and researching concepts that were based on more macro level factors, things like social institutions. Within that, we could consider economic factors. So, although such conceptualizations is elementary by today's standards, this did have a significant influence on the sociological thinking that followed, particularly of Andre Gary. So Gary was a French lawyer, and he published a report that examined statistics and concluded that property crimes were higher in wealthy areas, but violent crimes was much higher in poor areas. And this report was from Crime Statistics in France in the early 1800s. Now, some researchers have claimed that this report is likely the first scientific study of criminology, and this was later expanded and published into a book. Now, Gary concluded that opportunity, in the sense that the wealthy had more to steal, was a primary cause of poverty. This might sound familiar. Think of routine activities theory, right? Um, Now, think about this. There is more to steal in the wealthier areas, and that the poor individuals will use opportunities to steal goods and currency from wealthy households or establishments. So that's one background, one theorist. Now we have, I don't know how to pronounce his name very well. I'll just call him by his first name, Adolphe. He was a Belgian researcher. Like Gary, he examined French statistics in the mid 1800s. Now, besides showing relative stability in the trends of crime rates in France, like the age distribution and female to male ratios of offending, Adolphe also showed that certain types of individuals were more likely to commit crime. Now, specifically, he showed that young, male, poor, uneducated, and unemployed individuals were more likely to commit crime than were their counterparts. And this is important because this is also supported by modern research. Now, similar to Gary, Adolphe concluded that opportunities, in addition to the demographic characteristics, had a lot to do with where crime tended to be concentrated. Again, this may sound familiar to other theories you may have looked at. Now, this theorist added a special component by identifying that greater inequality or gaps between wealth and poverty in the same place tend to excite temptations and passions. So, in other words, an area that exhibited a large difference in wealth, with many poor individuals and many wealthy individuals living in close proximity to each other, were going to have the biggest problems. And this is a concept that he referred to as relative deprivation, and it is quite a distinctive condition from that of just a state of poverty where everybody's in poverty. So the important thing here is that we're going to see crime in places where we have wealthy people and poor people in close proximity to each other. Although in areas of the country where there are very poor people living in close proximity to very wealthy people, this can cause animosity and feelings of deprivation compared with others in the area. Now, more modern day studies have supported this hypothesis. For example, like in Washington D.C., which is probably one of the most powerful cities in the world, it's also going to have a large portion of severely run down and poor areas, and it's going to have a high crime rate compared with any other jurisdiction in the country. There is modern studies that have supported this hypothesis, and they've showed a clear linear association between a higher crime rate and localities with more relative deprivation. For example, certain researchers have found that crime rates were far higher in cities that have wider gaps in income. Specifically, the larger the gap between the 10th and the 90th percentiles, the greater the crime levels that city was going to exhibit. Now, um, Adolphe is quite probably best known for this particular comment, and it was the crimes committed seem to be a necessary result of our social organization. Society prepares a crime, and the guilty are only the instruments by which it is executed. So it seems like he is not necessarily putting the blame on crime on society, but he's not. He's definitely not putting it on the person. It's kind of seems like this is what the cards that these individuals are dealt because of the society they live in. So again, this crime is a result of societal structure and not the individual propensities or personal decision making that we've seen in previous theories or that we've discussed in other weeks within this class. So this is not surprising given his position was controversial at the time when he had these ideas, because during this time a lot of theorists were still focusing on free will and deterrence, and this is something that we've discussed extensively in class. Um, and he was attacked by critics for removing all decision-making capabilities from his model of behavior. And he argued that his model could help lower crime rates by leading to social reforms. In other words, we didn't necessarily need to fix people, we needed to fix our society so that there wouldn't be such a high propensity for crime, because in his view it was society that was giving the opportunity for those crimes. So social reforms would address the inequalities of the social structure. such as those between that big gap between the wealthy and the poor. Now, going back to Gary and Adolphi's work, one of the essential points is the positivistic nature. Remember the difference between the classical and the positivist ideas. So this is going to be a positivist theory in nature. These two individuals, they both concluded that the distribution of crime is not random. Instead, it is a result of certain types of persons committing certain types of crime in particular places, and mostly due in part because of the way that society is structured and the way that resources are distributed. Now, this perspective of criminality strongly supports the tendency of crime to be clustered in certain places as well as among certain persons in these places. And these findings support a structural positivistic perspective of criminality, through which criminality is seen as being deterministic and thus caused by factors outside of an individual's control, which is very different from what we discussed previously in this class. So now we have Durkheim. And Durkheim has this concept which he calls anomie, right? So Durkheim developed a general model of societal development largely based on the economic and labor distribution in which societies are seen as evolving from a simplistic mechanical society toward a multi-layered organic society. Now, in his dissertation, in which he titled The Division of Labor in Society, there was what he called the primitive mechanical societies that exist as those in which all members essentially perform the same functions, such as hunting, right? And these are typically going to be males, and gathering, which may be the females. Now, even though there are a few anomalies like the medicine man, virtually everyone experiences essentially the same daily routine. Now, such similarities in daily routine and constant interaction with like members of the society lead to a strong uniformity in the values of that society. And Durkheim called this collective conscience. Now, the collective conscience is a degree to which individuals of a society think alike, or as Durkheim put it, the totality of social likeness. Now, due to very little variation in the distribution of labor in these primitive mechanical societies, which you see here on the left in this table, the individuals in such societies tend to share similar norms and values, and this creates a simple layered social structure with a strong collective conscience. This is because people have more or less the same jobs and mostly interact with similar individuals. They tend to think and act alike, which creates a strong solidarity among its members. In mechanical societies, law functions to inform the conformity of the group. Now, other societies have progressed toward a more modern, organic society in the industrial age, and that is the one we see here on the right in orange. And the distribution of labor becomes more highly specified during this time period. Now, there is still a form of solidarity in organic societies called organic solidarity because people tend to depend on other groups in society through the highly specified division of labor. And laws' primary function to regulate interaction and maintain solidarity among the groups. Now, let me go back. Just to give you a moment here, you can pause it if you want to take any notes here. I just wanted to go to figure 8.1 so you could see the difference between the mechanical society and the organic society that I was discussing. And here's the main points that I brought up earlier when I had that figure displayed. You could pause it at any point in time so that you can take notes on this. But I'm going to continue now discussing Durkheim's theories. So Durkheim said that with rapid change, right, there was rapid change happening during the Industrial Revolution. The ability of society to serve as a regulatory mechanism breaks down, and the selfish, greedy tendencies of individuals are uncontrolled. And this would cause what he referred to as anomie or normlessness. Now, societies in such anomic states would experience increases in many social problems. And in this case, particularly criminal activity. Think of the Great Depression and the 1960s. Now, in this case, rapid change can be due to numerous factors, right? And this could be something like a war or any type of social movements, right? Now, Durkheim was clear that it really did not matter whether the rapid change was for a good thing or a bad thing. Either way, it would have negative effects on society. And this is why I mentioned the 1960s along with the Great Depression. So, for example, whether the US economy was improving, right, in the 1960s, is why I mentioned it, or quickly tanking as it was during the Great Depression, according to Durkheim, both of these would produce more criminal activity due to the lack of stability in regulating human expectations and desires. Now, interestingly, both of these periods, the late 1960s and the 30s, showed the greatest crime waves of the 20th century, the 1900s, particularly for crimes like murder. Now, another fact that supports Durkheim's predictions is that middle and upper class individuals have higher suicide rates than those do from lower classes. Now, something else um, that Durkheim had a great contribution to was the study of suicide. And he wrote a book titled Suicide. And he claimed that suicide was indeed a social fact. Now, Durkheim took an act, and this, again, suicide, that would seem to be the ultimate form of free choice or free will. And he showed that this decision to take your own life is largely determined by external social factors. Again, we're going away from these original ideas that we discussed previously in this class. And, to be clear here, Durkheim, he claimed that suicide was a social fact. In other words, that it was a product of meanings and structural aspects that result from interactions among individuals. He was able to show that the rate of suicide was significantly lower among individuals who were married, young, and adherents of religions that were more interactive and communal. Think of religions like Judaism. All these characteristics boil down to one aspect, and that is that the more social interaction and bonding with the community, the less suicide there will be. So Durkheim concluded that variations in suicide rates are due to differences in social solidarity or bonding to society. Now, after Durkheim, we have Merton. All right. Now, Merton was influenced by Durkheim's concept of anomie. So, the one thing that all forms of string theory do have in common, so remember, there's going to be different types of string theories that we're going to keep discussing as this presentation goes on, is that their emphasis on a sense of frustration and crime causation, um, that's what it's going to be focused on. So they're going to the strain theory is gonna focus on a sense of frustration that's gonna cause crime. In other words, people are gonna be strained, and that's why it's a derivative of the strain theory. Now, although the theories differ regarding exactly what's causing the frustration, as well as in the way individuals are gonna cope with such stress and anger, they're all going to identify the strain placed on an individual as the primary cause um, for the development of crime. Now, in the 1930s, when Merton was formulating his theory of structural strain, he drew heavily on Durkheim's idea of anomie. Now, he was able to combine Durkheim's concepts and propositions with an emphasis on American culture. So his structural model, Merton's structural model, became one of the most popular perspectives in the criminological thought in the early 1900s, and it's going to remain one of the most cited theories in criminological literature. So it obviously had a very high impact in this field. Now, his his most important contribution was written in 1938, and this was right after or right around the time of the Great Depression. So it came in at a very good time. Now, as I was saying, as far as the Great Depression, it was in 1929 that there was a stock market crash. So 9 years later, when Merton came up with his when he wrote this piece, individuals were still seeing the effects, and he was able to study these effects. So with that market crash, virtually every aspect of life in the United States was affected. Unemployment rose, extreme poverty soared, and suicide rates also rose. And not only that, but so did crimes, particularly murder rates. So it's not surprising that there was a fertile ground in American society for a theory of crime that placed virtually all the blame on the economic structure of the United States. So not only was society ready for a perspective such as strain theory, remember, one of the objectives here is to assess why this theory came into place at the time it did. And again, think of everything I just told you, that the historical element that I told you, Great Depression, United States, unemployment's rising, extreme poverty is going up, suicide rates are going up, crime is going up, right? So this is the perfect time to come up with a theory like this. So on the other side of the coin, though, Merton was highly influenced by what he saw happening to the country during the Great Depression. And specifically, he observed how the economic institutions impacted almost all the other social factors, and most particularly, it was crime. He watched how the breakdown of the economic structure drove people to kill themselves or others, not to mention the rise in property crimes like theft. And after all, many individuals who had once been successful were now poor, and some felt driven to crime for survival, right? Um, like the story of selling a loaf of bread so you can essentially um, feed your family. Um, Now, one of the key assumptions distinguishing strain theory from Durkheim's perspective, again, this is one of the objectives, the key differences between Merton's idea and Durkheim's. Remember, Merton did build upon Durkheim's foundation, was that Merton altered his version of what anatomy means, a definition that we'll explore now. So, Merton discussed the nearly universal socialization of the American dream in the US society. So, what does this mean? This is the idea that as long as someone works hard and pays off his or her dues, that person will achieve every goal in the end. Now, if you're familiar with this is what we call the American dream. So, according to Merton, right, the socialized image of the goal is material wealth, whereas the socialized concept of the means of achieving the goal is hard work. For example, going to school, getting good grades so you could get a good job later on, or specifically the labor. So the conventional model of the American dream was consistent with the Protestant work ethic of working hard for a long time and knowing you will be repaid in the distant future. Um, Now, Merton claimed that nearly everyone is socialized to believe in this American dream, no matter what economic class you're raised in. So think about it. Um, you have, you know, you're told to go to school, go to college, get a good degree, you get a good job, and you'll have that American dream. And there is empirical support for this, right? And then, when we look at parents in society, they're oftentimes going to think of celebrities as an example of this process, specifically individuals that started off poor and then they rose to wealth. Think of, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, Mark Cuban, etc. Right? So now that these stories are going to epitomize the American dream, parents in society do not always teach the reality of the situation. And Merton points out, you know, while there is a small percentage of persons that could rise from the lower class to become materially successful, the reality is that the vast majority of poor children really don't have much chance of ever obtaining such wealth. Now, again, this is according to Merton. So it is the near universal socialization of the American dream without it being obtainable in most cases that's going to cause most of the strain and frustration in the American society. Now, Merton claims that most of the strain and frustration is due not necessarily to the failure to achieve the conventional goal, which is the wealth, but instead to the differential emphasis placed on the material goals and the de-emphasis of the importance of the conventional means. So, Merton's concept of anomie and strain, um, he's going to claim that an ideal society would feature an unequal emphasis on the conventional goals and means in society. Although in many societies, one of these aspects would be emphasized more than the other. And Merton claimed that in the US, um, we are epitomizing the type of society that emphasizes goals far above the actual means. And there is a disequilibrium in the emphasis between the goals and means of societies. And this disequilibrium is what Merton is going to refer to as anomie. So, like Durkheim's original idea, Merton's anomie was a negative state for society, although the two men had different explanations for how this state of society came about. Again, going back to our original objective. So while Durkheim believed that anomie was primarily caused by society transitioning too fast to maintain its regulatory control over members, all right, think of social movements, uh, think of a war, etc. For Merton, anomie represented too much focus on the goals of wealth instead in the United States at the expense of the conventional means. So, what do we mean by this? There's a good example of how the goals are emphasized more than the means in our society. But the best way to illustrate this is through a hypothetical situation. And the Tibbets text gives a good one. So, a group of individuals are asked which of the following two men would be more respected by youth or even by some adults in our society. The first person is John. John has a PhD in physics but lives in a one-bedroom apartment because he can find only a job as a postdoctoral student and he's going to get a stipend of $25,000 a year. Joe, on the other hand, is relatively successful as a drug dealer and he owns a four-bedroom home, drives a Hummer, dropped out of school in 10th grade, and makes roughly 90,000 K a year. Now, in the years of asking this question to the classes that the authors of this book teach, with very few exceptions, Joe is usually the individual that is respected more. Now, he appears to have obtained what is called the American dream because of the material aspects. Nobody really cared about the means that he did it, drug dealing. They care about the material aspects that he was able to acquire after to fulfill the American dreams. Now, another way of supporting Merton's idea that America is too focused on the goal of material success is um, ask yourself, why are you taking the time to listen to my lecture or to take a college course um, related to this? Why are you going to enroll in college? Why are you going to try to graduate from college? And specifically, the question is if you knew for a fact that you will not get a better employment position by listening to this lecture or studying the text that goes along with it, or furthermore by earning a college degree, would you be learning this material just for your own edification? So, in more than a decade of posing this question to about 10,000 students in university courses, one of the authors of this book found that only about 5%, sometimes less, of respondents actually said yes. Interestingly, when asked the reason why um, they would put all this work into attending classes, many of them said they would do it for the partying or social life. So it appears that most college students will not be engaging in the hard work it takes to educate themselves if it weren't for some payoff at the end of the task. And in some ways, this supports Merton's claims that the emphasis is on the goals, with little or no intrinsic value placed on the work itself. And again, this is the means. Now, this phenomenon is not meant to be disheartening or a negative statement by Merton. In the end, it's only meant to exhibit the reality that American culture has and to show that it is quite common in our society to place the emphasis on the goal of financial success instead of hard work for hard work's actual sake